Nixon to put the pieces together.
He'd also seen what was happening in California. He knew that there were a lot of similarities between California and the Florida he was seeing, and he surmised that the same sort of thing was happening in Texas and perhaps in border states like Virginia and North Carolina.
In 1964, Republicans nominated a man from the Sun Belt for president, Arizona conservative Barry Goldwater. Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act, and his extreme views on foreign policy were deemed dangerous even by some in his own party, but not by Richard Nixon.
And he is the man who, after the greatest campaign in history, will be Mr. President, Barry Goldwater.
Goldwater was seen as an embarrassment to most of the moderate and liberal Republicans. A lot of them refused to campaign for Barry Goldwater during the general election. Richard Nixon gave hundreds of appearances, and people thought he was crazy.
It certainly looked that way as Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society scored a landslide victory over Goldwater.
Goldwater in 1964 was really a disaster for the Republican Party. The state legislatures, the town halls, the city councils, right straight down to the city ward town committees, everything was practically lost.
Goldwater carried only 6 states in 1964, but Nixon noted that 5 of them were in the Deep South, a first for the party of Lincoln since Reconstruction. They weren't called red states back then, but red state America was taking shape.
Goldwater was too much of a radical package in 1964. But what he did then was that he broke the democratic loyalty of the Deep South.
9 months later, events across the country would change the political landscape still further. The Watts section of Los Angeles went up in flames. Years of resentment over racial discrimination erupted into violence.
The police had the idea that their job was to keep the darkies in line, because just looking at them you could tell that they were criminal. Well, when the 60s came along and blacks began to be uppity, cops really got tough.
What made the Watts riot especially significant is that the TV station KTLA in Los Angeles was the first to have a helicopter with a camera attached to it. So basically you had the whole nation watching this live TV show for 4 straight days of black people burning down what looked like the city of Los Angeles.
When the smoke cleared, 34 were dead and more than 1,000 were injured. Hundreds of buildings lay in ruins. So did Johnson's dreams of a great society. Summer after summer, the violence spread from city to city.
The race riots absolutely gobsmacked Lyndon Johnson. He did not see them coming, and he was absolutely baffled. After all this wonderful legislation, after all these wonderful poverty programs, how could these people turn around and start burning down their neighborhoods?
In some cities, blacks campaigned to integrate white neighborhoods. The backlash was swift. Martin Luther King Jr. joined marchers in Chicago, and they were met by crowds of angry whites. King was struck by a stone.
I feel you're in a closed society, Dr. King, here in the southwest side.
Oh, yes. It's definitely a closed society, and we're going to make it an open society.
Lyndon Johnson's liberal consensus was coming apart at the seams.
There is a new political movement forming. And it is a political movement which is antithetical to all of this black stuff, black stuff, black stuff.
northern suburbanites, northern bungalow dwellers in cities like Chicago are beginning to see the civil rights movement as a threat to their own sense of well-being and security, as a threat to their property rights, as a threat to their property values. People were not feeling these issues through with their intellect. They were feeling them with their gut. Richard Nixon was a politician who responded to that gut feeling.
It was 1966, a year of midterm elections. He saw an opportunity for a Republican comeback, and along with it, his own.
He went all over the country. You're running for county commissioner in Marshall County, Mississippi, and you write Richard Nixon and say, I'm having a fundraiser, would you come? There he goes off to Holly Springs and he makes the speech.
This is going to be a Republican year across this country, the best one in 20 years for the candidates for the House, Senate, and Governor.
He campaigned for, raised money for representatives, senators, even in state houses. So they all knew him and they all felt some obligation to him.
He lined up chits. He was very much a collector of chits. Chits, that means I owe you. You owe me.
But more important than just the chits, that was an election in which the Republicans made major gains.
Some were dramatic. In Florida, Claude Kirk became the first Republican governor in 90 years. And a former movie actor named Ronald Reagan swept into the governor's mansion in California. But these developments alone wouldn't be enough to bring Nixon back. An unpopular foreign war would help.
Johnson's great historic mistake was that he promised us that he would not send American boys to fight in Vietnam. As clear as that. I will not send American boys to Southeast Asia to fight in the land war. And then he did.
Vietnam was a disaster. The country was so divided, it was perhaps more divided than at any time since the Civil War.
A growing anti-war movement filled the headlines. But below the radar, a conservative counter-movement was also on the rise.
In 1967, I was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin, a true hotbed of anti-war activism. At that moment, even with all of the activists at Wisconsin, the largest single club on the Wisconsin campus was the Young Republicans.
We had an awful lot of people who didn't particularly like the war, but they'd prefer that we win it if we could. And they weren't going to support the people who jumped up and down at the liberal rallies.
Take the camera, you hard-headed communist swine. Don't you see that the Constitution is letting you assemble? That communism would strike it down, would strike down everything our government stands for.
Is there some way that we can get together? Is there some way we can reconcile our differences?
Because I have a son that's going to go into the Army.
With Americans at each other's throats, Tricky Dick found Johnson's most vulnerable spot and inserted the knife.
The administration now is committing America to the kind of a war that we should not be fighting in Vietnam. It's a ground war and it's a long war. That's the kind of a war the communists want because they want to bleed us white.
What he was trying to do was get under Lyndon Johnson's skin, to make Lyndon Johnson call out Richard Nixon by name as a competitor. Suddenly, Richard Nixon was on the front page again. Richard Nixon was in the news. Richard Nixon was a debating partner of the president. Richard Nixon was the leader of a leaderless opposition party.
1967 brought the summer of love. Many young Americans, disillusioned with politics, were turning on, tuning in, and dropping out.
Going on simultaneously was a growing dissatisfaction with American life, the commitment to materialism. The youth was rebelling against that.
Very quickly, the promise of the 60s turned into bitterness and polarization and what you call the generation gap.
The parents of that era came out of a very routinized existence of job, family, suburbs. And here you had a generation that was saying, well, we don't like where you guys have been sending us. You know, we don't like when you're sending us into this routine. We don't like when you're sending us to the war. Finally, a generation said enough of that stuff.
In the 60s, a lot of the left was talking about America as if it was this awful, horrible place. The word of the day was alienation. The kind of folks who followed Richard Nixon didn't necessarily feel that alienation. They were perfectly happy to live in a middle-class consumer society.
The 60s and the counterculture were perfect for him to run against. The country was virtually on the brink of a nervous breakdown. And Richard Nixon, having persevered, offered himself as the person who understood the concerns of, he would have said, the common man, and all these things going on. And he was going to bring calm and peace and order.
Nixon recognized that much of America, his America, was watching it all at home and yearning for a real-life Joe Friday, the square cop who set things straight every Thursday night in prime time.
Marijuana is the flame, heroin is the fuse, LSD is the bomb. You may sell that jazz to another pothead, but not to somebody who spends most of their time holding some sick kid's head while he vomits and retches sitting on a curbstone at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Nixon's own button-down image scored points with the folks who sat in front of their TVs. He played it to the hilt in photo ops alongside establishment icons like comedian Jackie Gleason.
He positioned himself to benefit from the public reaction to the social movements of the 60s.
The theory was, because of the riots, because of all this resentment of the Great Society, of the students, that he could put together blue-collar workers who had voted Democratic with the South.
Nixon embarked on a Southern strategy to win friends and influence voters in Dixie. He saw Florida as an essential component and made an uninvited appearance at the social event of the season in Palm Beach, the wedding of Governor Claude Kirk.
The reception, of course, was in a grand ballroom full of cameras and people who wanted to be seen, and drew a hell of a crowd and a lot of media coverage. Anybody was invited. You didn't have to be invited, really. A lot of people just showed up. All of a sudden, Nixon arrived. Hey, Claude, how are you? It was good press.
It all worked like a charm. Nixon was back in the limelight. But the pundits still viewed the idea of his comeback with deep skepticism. To Lyndon Johnson, Nixon was still the perennial loser.
Johnson loved the idea of running against Richard Nixon in 1968. I said, bring him on. I mean, who wouldn't? He was the Job of American politics.
Now, my answer to those who say, because I have lost a couple of elections, can I win it? I believe I'm going to win the New Hampshire primary, will go on to win the nomination, and if I do that, I will be the strongest candidate, and I believe I can beat Lyndon Johnson.
But Nixon wouldn't face Lyndon Johnson in 1968. The North Vietnamese offensive at the start of the year convinced many that America was losing the war. A dejected Johnson announced that he wouldn't seek another term.
The president was overwhelmed by the war. The mud of Indochina would pretty much end his great society. I hated the war, and by the end of the administration, I hated Johnson as well.
It was a year of gut-wrenching calamities. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy entered the presidential race. He, too, was gunned down. With his death, the Democratic nomination would go to Vice President Hubert Humphrey.
It doesn't make any difference where you're from. It's what you stand for.
Bad news for Nixon was the entry into the race of Alabama Governor George Wallace. America's most outspoken segregationist, was running as an independent. He threatened to cause Nixon precious Southern votes. Nixon, it seemed, could kiss his Southern strategy goodbye.